Welcome back, everyone. This is the third part of the IPCC's 6th Assessment Report video series. If you haven't done so already, I highly recommend going back to watch Part 1, The Physical Basis of Climate Change, which talks about how greenhouse gas emissions are causing unprecedented environmental changes, and Part 2, Impacts, Adaptations, and Vulnerability, which talks about how these changes are impacting the ecosystem and human society. The first two working group contributions to AR6 paint a pretty bleak picture of our current circumstances. So now let's talk about what we can do to fix things. In April 2022, Working Group 3 released its contribution to AR6, entitled Mitigation of Climate Change. First, let's start off with the state of the climate now. We all know our greenhouse gas emissions have been on the rise since the pre-industrial era. Between 1850 and 2019, we have emitted about 2,400 gigatons of CO2 into the atmosphere. More than 40% of these emissions have occurred after 1990. And although the rate of growth in emissions seems to be slowing down due to improvements in energy and technology, humans still emitted more greenhouse gases in the past decade than in any previous decade. Even in 2020, when worldwide COVID-19 lockdowns went into effect, CO2 emissions dropped in the first half of the year, but already started rebounding by the end of the year. It's also important to note that different regions of the world differ greatly in the amount of carbon emissions they emit. More developed countries and wealthy households continue to contribute a disproportionately large amount of emissions. The good news is that low-emission technologies like solar power, wind power, and lithium-ion batteries have become cheaper every year since 2010. This comes alongside a consistent expansion of governmental policies and investment in climate tech innovation and mitigation strategies. Progress has been slower in some regions than others, especially when considering the goals and commitments countries made in the 2016 Paris Agreement to limit global warming under 2 degrees Celsius and under 1.5 degrees Celsius if possible. It now seems very likely that we will exceed 1.5 degrees warming, and staying under 2 degrees of warming will take an enormous global effort to adopt carbon-reducing technologies and climate change mitigation strategies. Without strengthening the policies we already have in place, it is likely we will see global warming levels closer to 3 degrees Celsius, which is far from ideal, but not catastrophic. So now that we know we can avoid a climate change doomsday, what concrete actions will we need to take to lower our greenhouse gas emissions? One part of the solution is scaling back our consumption of fossil fuels and switching to cleaner, cheaper, renewable sources of power like solar and wind energy and hydrogen fuel to reduce our carbon emissions. But to reach net zero and eventually net negative carbon emissions, we must also implement carbon dioxide removal strategies. These include carbon capture from point sources like industrial flue stacks, direct air capture, reforestation efforts, ocean alkalinity enhancement, carbon sequestration, and more. This will take a greater effort for some economic sectors and regions of the world than others. For example, reducing emissions from the industrial sector, which is required to make high-demand materials like cement, steel, and plastics, is going to be particularly challenging. Materials manufacturers are going to have to invest heavily in decarbonization technologies, in addition to increasing energy efficiency and adopting new production processes wherever possible. Densely populated urban areas are going to have to make big changes to building and transportation infrastructure. Policies that repurpose and retrofit existing buildings, plan new buildings to be energy efficient, increase access to public transportation, and decarbonize city supply chains should be fully supported and funded. In the transportation sector, carbon emissions can be reduced through the adoption of electric vehicles and sustainable biofuels. Some forms of transportation, like aviation and shipping, are less able to rely on these clean energy solutions that are currently working for smaller vehicles. Therefore, we need to provide more funding and resources to improve these heavy-duty carbon-emitting transportation modes as well. Sustainable agriculture and improving forestry will also play an important role. Although their impacts are a bit slower and cannot immediately help us offset our emissions from other sectors, the large-scale carbon reductions they can deliver over time will be crucial to meeting our goals. It can also provide valuable co-benefits, like boosting biodiversity and sustaining the livelihoods of farmers and native populations. It even makes financial sense to invest in climate mitigation strategies. In most of the literature and models assessed by Working Group 3, the economic benefit of adopting mitigation strategies now will far outweigh the costs, especially considering how just the cost to fix the damage caused by climate-related disasters is increasing every year. To make these changes, it's going to take more than the effort of farmers, industry workers, and researchers. It's going to require international cooperation to make sure everyone has access to and actually demands to use these technologies. That's why IPCC scientists urge policymakers to carefully think of the best way to put these mitigation strategies into action, so we can truly help the communities and ecosystems that are most vulnerable to climate change. And that concludes Part 3 of the IPCC's 6th Assessment Report. There is one final section of AR6, the Synthesis Report, which will highlight the new scientific data that has emerged on climate change since AR5. That report is due to come out later in 2022, so if you'd like a video on that, make sure to give this video a like and subscribe. Thanks for watching!